In 2014, he received the Karmi Harari Mid-Career Award.
Patients always know what is the right treatment.
So tell us a little bit about what made you, or what inspired.
They want suggestions, they want to learn exercises, they want to maybe have assignments that they can do in between sessions.
Different people are likely to be helped by different things.
But it should be done in a way that you have an understanding of why it's been done.
Welcome to Khan Klinics, your dedicated space for exploring the vital connections that shape your well-being. Here we dive into everything from achieving peak physical fitness by mastering sustainable weight management to optimizing your diet for a vibrant life. We're passionate about uncovering the power interplay between your mental and physical health, offering you insightful strategies to nurture both. Join us as we unlock the secrets to embark on your self-confidence and your inspiration by interviewing the top-rated personalities, not from only the US, but around the world. At Khan Klinics, our commitment is to bring you evidence-based information that inspires you confidently control your health journey and live your life to the absolute fullness. I'm your host, Amir Khan. Let's get ready to unlock the true potential of being a human with the most amazing people around us. There's quite a lot of changes ongoing in the psychology field, and new terms and distinct concepts being introduced. And one of them is relational depth. Why is it important in therapy?
So relational depth is about moments of deep, profound meeting in the therapeutic encounter. And that's something that I'm sure people will have experienced at times in their lives, maybe with friends, maybe with family members, where you really feel that the other person knows you and gets you, where you feel that you can open up about something that is maybe difficult to talk about, and you feel that the other person really accepts that and can be with you in that. And of course, that happens a lot in therapy. What we know is that people who are isolated or who have difficulties in relationships often do have poorer mental health, and that psychological problems are at times associated with being more isolated in the world. Certainly a lack of close supportive relationships is one of the best predictors, not just of mental health problems, but also physical health problems. So being able to open up to a therapist and to talk about what's going on for you and being honest about that, because sometimes you can have a lot of people around you, but if there's not really anyone that you can be honest with, you can still end up feeling quite isolated, because it feels like nobody really knows what you're suffering from or what you're worried about, or maybe what you're sad about. You may feel that you have to put on a brave face. And if you can be with somebody where you can talk about that, and as a therapist, our role is to listen, to help you explore that, not to judge, then there's a depth of connection that can both feel healing in itself, and our research shows that patients can experience that as healing, but also kind of forms a bridge whereby you can then feel maybe more able to talk about it with other people. We did some research recently around young people in schools, and what they were saying is that one of the things they liked about the counsellor was that sometimes by opening up to the counsellor, they could then talk to other people in their lives about their problems, like their parents, and they could tell their parents what was going on. The counsellor provided a kind of safe space in which they could experience talking about these issues, experience that it wasn't the end of the world to talk about these issues, and then that allowed them to feel that they could maybe take the risk of opening that up in another space. Of course, one would hope that that space then is also a safe one and a valuing one, where they can then talk about those issues with others, and by doing so, they can feel less isolated and they can begin to find solutions. One of the things I guess we learn as therapists is that repressing things, not talking about things, generally doesn't help. That if people keep things inside and keep things separated off, it's generally not as helpful as being able to talk about it, provided talking about it is safe and the other person is accepting and understanding.
That's very fascinating. Thank you for explaining that, Mick. Let me move on to another concept, and that is from your book, Existential Therapies. It focuses on human experiences, core human experiences, for example, death, freedom, and meaning. And whilst you were doing that, you're also talking about a collaborative, client-centered approach. That's our pluralistic therapy or approach. How do you see the existential therapy fitting into today's fast-paced, ever so evolving landscape, especially the mental health landscape?
Yeah, I mean, things are very fast-paced, and it's very easy to get it caught up with everything that's going on in the world and social media and friendships and communication and work and emails. But from an existential perspective, there are some fundamental questions that we all face about death, about what is the meaning, what is the purpose of our lives, what does it mean to be a human being, spiritual questions as well. And I guess with the fast-pacedness of everything, it's easy to avoid these difficult questions because often they are very difficult, and often it's tempting not to want to really ask them. And existential philosophers have argued that many people can spend their whole lives never really addressing these most fundamental questions, that they live their lives without really asking it. But sometimes people can have maybe a crisis, maybe somebody very close to them dies, maybe they get to a point in their lives where they're thinking, what actually is my life about, where they start asking these questions. And from an existential perspective, we would say, well, sometimes that can actually be quite helpful. It's not easy and it's not necessarily comfortable to be thinking, what actually is my life about? What am I trying to do? But rather than seeing that as a breakdown or as a problem, we can see it as an opportunity to ask some really fundamental questions that are probably always there. I suspect that many of us in our lives have asked questions like, what is it I'm trying to do? But we get so caught up in the everydayness of life that we then lose touch with those questions. And existential therapies or existential approaches give us a chance to go back to those questions and think them through with somebody who, again, like with relational depth, will take them seriously, will help us think about them, won't judge, will give us the time that we need, as lots of good therapists would do, to be able to ask these very serious questions and often difficult questions. These are complex questions where there often aren't easy answers, and it can be very tempting to ask the questions that have the easiest answers. But sometimes the most important questions are the ones where there aren't easy answers and where the therapist won't have the answers either. But what they will do is that they will be willing to sit with you and help you think about these questions and to do that together. So at least it's not something you're alone with.
Excellent. Thank you for explaining that. So we've got now a pluralistic approach. We also have relational depth, and we've talked about existential therapy. So when we are applying all of this and you're counseling your patients, you discuss the deep, authentic connection between a client and a therapist. What are the ways therapists you think can cultivate this depth, whether it's a short term, and especially in the newer online therapy formats that we are seeing? How do you go about doing this?
Well, probably to begin with, I'd say not necessarily something you would spend a lot of time discussing. It's more about establishing a kind of relationship that, a lot of psychotherapists would do. The first step, of course, is listening. And as a therapist, what I would do with the people that I work with, first and foremost, is to try and understand their story deeply, to understand the nuances and the complexities, particularly to understand the emotions. And as many psychotherapists would do, we're very interested in how people are feeling, the feelings that go on beneath the thoughts and the ideas. So we tend to avoid getting into too much of a kind of analytical conversation, but to understand what are those feelings, maybe some of the more difficult feelings. And if I, as a therapist, can understand those difficult feelings, and I can put myself, in a sense, in the shoes of the person that I'm working with, then that's where the depth of connection starts to emerge. And that I can then bring my understandings, my sense, my questions, my kind of creativity into that relationship as a way of facilitating that exploration. But it would really come first and foremost through listening and through understanding, because particularly when we're getting down to those really deep existential questions that patients might have, it's not something that I can preempt, or I can't know really what those issues are. It takes a lot of careful listening. I think one of the things in today's fast-paced world is that we are often not just looking for answers, but very quick to give people answers. So if we're listening to people, we might say, well, have you thought about this? Have you tried that? What about this? And certainly from a pluralistic standpoint, that can be very helpful. Sometimes people haven't thought about it. It can be really useful to suggest, why don't you talk to this person, or have you told your partner how you're feeling? And that can be very useful advice. But I think in my experience, the most useful advice comes from first really listening to somebody, because there's always a risk that if you jump in with advice first off, that if we haven't really understood what somebody's facing, then it can be patronizing, or it can be misjudged, it can be irrelevant. The people that we work with are intelligent, they're informed, and if there was an easy answer, generally they probably would have found it already. So the reason that they're coming to us, and the reason when people are at the stage of talking about problems, often it's because they've thought about it and there aren't immediate and obvious answers. And what therapists can do, which is a lot of the training actually, is rather than rushing to give an answer, is being able to sit with that not knowing for enough time to really understand, not for the sake of itself, but so that there's enough time to really understand what somebody's grappling with.
Thank you for explaining that, Mick. Mick, last two questions, and one of them is related to social media, the influence of social media on just generally on humans, and the effect now that the people that are coming with disorders that are quite distinctly different from what we were seeing in say, for example, 10 years ago. A lot of anxiety, a lot of awareness about things, especially the younger school-going kids. How has that affected the pluralistic approach in general and the other areas that we've just discussed? Has it made any change?
It's a very good question, and unfortunately, I don't know the research well enough to be able to say too much about that. I certainly know that a lot of people are very, very concerned about the impact that social media has. My understanding of the research is that it's quite complex and it's quite mixed, and that it's not quite as straightforward as social media is creating more anxiety. As I say, though, that I'm not an expert. I think from a pluralistic approach, but that does reflect a pluralistic approach, which is just being a bit wary about saying, okay, there's a simple answer here that social media is creating this. It might be that the research shows very conclusively that it is. But I think that what we would want to do is to listen to somebody's own perspective and somebody's experience. That if we're working, say, with a young person who's struggling with social media, maybe they're experiencing bullying or racism through social media, and that it's a real problem with them, we would work with it on the basis that it is a problem. But it might also be that there's young people who are saying, actually, this is a way of reaching out, connecting with my friends. This is a way that I feel more comfortable in the world. And rather than seeing that and thinking, well, yeah, but it is really a problem, I think we'd want to listen to the person's story themselves and work with them to work out what was the best solution. So rather than us being the expert and coming in and saying, right, we know what this is about, working with that person to understand what it means for them. And I think people have very complex relationships with social media. I mean, we're on the internet now. It means that I can talk to you over in Texas and have conversations that we couldn't have recently. There's a lot of good things that I think it can do, as well as, obviously, as we know, a lot of problem areas.
Well, thank you for explaining that. And I think, it's something that the kids especially are intrigued by and sort of like looking forward to. How is it evolving, changing? The next question is also, Mick, very similar-ish and very much in hype in the US right now. And that is about the AI change and the revolution that's sort of going on, the impact that it's having on humans. A lot of these novice minds are feeling, again, very anxious about things. Some are feeling very depressed. And honestly speaking, a lot of people are seeing, as a society, a big change and a wave that is already occurring. I want to know your views on this, and B, what advice would you give to people who are already now experiencing this change?
Well, my answer is going to be similar to the last one, really, which is that I think from a pluralistic standpoint, we're just cautious about making too much generalizations about what impact this is going to have. Certainly, there's a danger with AI. There's many, many threats. I think we know from AI that it can give very misleading information, that people can become dependent on it, the risks of it escalating and creating AI and having a system where, AI really is very dominant. But at the same time, I mean, I know for myself, for instance, with ChatGPT, that I do find it incredibly helpful at times. Some of the mental health and some of the health advice it gives, it feels pretty sound. I think in terms of advice, one of the things is just being really cautious. I mean, I've been working on a book recently where I've been using AI to look for references and see what literature is out there. And some of that is incredible, that I can ask a question and it can find sources that would have taken me a long time to find. But at the same time, some of the sources that it's generating with papers and digital object identifiers are completely imaginary. They just don't exist at all. And so I think we have to be incredibly cautious about what AI is suggesting, and particularly when it's around important issues. I think the reality is that it is going to get more part of our lives. So the question is, how do we use it? How do we make the most of it? How do we protect ourselves against the biggest dangers of it? I think as therapists, obviously people are going to be turning to the AI and asking questions. I have a colleague who's developing an AI therapist, and that's been advancing a lot to a point where I think that in many ways it can be very helpful. So if it's suggesting maybe breathing exercises or mindfulness exercises. But what AI won't ever be able to do, by definition, is to have that relational depth that we were talking about earlier, that you can't have relational depth with an AI, because by definition, and relational depth is about having a connection with somebody who cares about you and having a human to human connection. So I think there will always be a place for therapists and for therapy, for being with somebody who can help you explore those issues and is more than just an AI voice. And I think it means that potentially that those human to human connections, the more spiritual connections, as well as the more interpersonal connections, will have a more prominent place in our lives, because so many of the more technical things can be taken over by AI. But perhaps what it will leave us with is a more spiritual, human, connected ways of being, in the best case scenario, So I think there's a lot of potential as well as risks.
Thank you for explaining that, Mick. Final question. We'd love to know your message to our audience. Is there a final message you'd like to give them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging time in the world at the moment. And there's, certainly in the UK, and I think around the world, we know there's a lot going on. But I think that psychology and psychotherapy brings hope in some ways at a low level. It's not big and dramatic, but I think what we've learned as therapists is that more understanding between people, more compassion, more caring relationships is possible. We see through our trainings, through the work that we do, that it's possible to grow empathy, compassion, understanding. And I think that gives me a lot of hope for the kind of world we can have where we are more able to get on with each other, more able to be compassionate across peoples, across cultures, across nations, and move towards a global society, a world in which we can have more of what we want and the mental health and well-being that we all deserve. So it's lovely talking to you, Amir. Thank you very much for asking the questions.
Appreciate that, and an incredibly insightful conversation, Mick. Thank you for so openly sharing your side and your profound expertise. We wish you the best in the future. You've truly shown us that even from the rock bottom, there's a path, purpose, and there's still work to be done, but I think we're on the right pathway. Thank you for being with us. What a remarkable journey we've just experienced together. The path to health isn't always straight, but it's always worth the effort. I hope today's conversation inspired you to take the next step in your wellness journey, armed with new knowledge and a fresh perspective. If today's episode left you inspired, share it with people, someone who need to hear this. Give us a thumbs up and your opinion. Keep exploring, keep evolving, and we'll see you in the next episode of Khan Klinics.